I picked up this book, A Will to Change, expecting a healthy roadmap of masculinity from the point of view of a feminist who is purportedly nuanced and genuinely cares about males. Instead of this healthy roadmap, I instead stumbled onto what felt like a philosophical trap. The central premise of this book relies on a definition of patriarchy that is so broad, so loose, and so all encompassing that it is immune to any refutation. The loop argument that undergirds a lot of what this book talks about is as follows. The first premise is that patriarchy is the cause of all maladaptive masculine behavior. You might wonder, what is a maladaptive masculine behavior? Well, this takes us to premise B of the book, which is that it is a symptom of the patriarchy. So, what we have here is an argument that relies on itself for evidence without appealing to any independent evidence outside of the argument itself. If a man is domineering, it's patriarchy. If a man is struggling to express his emotions or be vulnerable, it's patriarchy. And if he disagrees with this assessment, well, he's just expressing patriarchal blindness. It's a closed loop and one that reflects a theology rather than a sociology. She relentlessly uses the word patriarchy interchangeably with oppression, so much so that any other book that she referenced in her book, whereby the person was alluding to some form of oppression, she decried for not using the word patriarchy, which, according to her, was the more or is the more apt terminology. She asks us to differentiate between masculinity and patriarchal masculinity, but nowhere in the book does she give us a clear line as to where we can separate these two. And every definition that she gives of masculinity seems to negate the idea of any biological underpinnings of what it means to be a male or what it means to be a female. Going by her definitions, one might think that there is absolutely no behavioral differences between males and females. Everything is just reduced to a simple social artifact, one that can quickly be erased if only people were to convert to this idea that everything essentially bad about the world, everything that reeks of oppression, whether it's racism or sexism, it all comes from this one wellspring of patriarchy. There's also this condescending identitarian subtext here. To disagree with her perspective or her definitions about patriarchy is to be ignorant or weak. It frames skepticism not as an intellectual disagreement, but rather as a moral failing. The book's most fatal flaw, as I alluded to a moment ago, is its complete dismissal of biology. Hooks treats gender roles as this arbitrary social fabrication, a sort of script that we are all forced to read by our culture. What she fails to recognize is that reproduction is the currency of evolution, and our behaviors are deeply rooted in what kept our ancestors alive long enough to pass on their genes to us. Behaviors that we inherited from them in order that we too might be able to stay alive and continue on to proliferate. As I read this book, this concept that's popularized by Jordan Peterson kept coming to mind, and that is the difference between equality of outcome and equality of opportunity. Equality of opportunity is a system where the playing field is made as level as possible. There might be a few bumps here and there, but the ideal is a place where anybody can flourish if they apply themselves. Equality of outcome, on the other hand, is an ideal whereby you stand essentially at the finish line, stopping people who have already reached there right before they cross that line, in order that people who come after them who meet a certain criteria, be it a race or a sex or whatever arbitrary identity that you feel is worth inflating their numbers artificially, is the one that you let through that finish line. What Hooks fails to recognize is that equality of opportunity leaves the gate wide open for natural tendencies to flourish. Instead, she wants to force people through the gate of ideology, while completely forgetting about the gate of biology. Throughout the book, Hooks mounts a relentless frontal assault on any idea of power. She seems to think that it is inherently toxic. Imagine a peacock that decides not to spread its feathers, its plumage, because of some higher ideals. Imagine how much power that would take. It has the most beautiful feathers, but it decides that in spite of this beautiful peahen that it wants to attract, it is going to hold that in. That is the ultimate form of power, the possession of the power, and yet the discernment to know when and how much of it to use. It is not the absence of that power. But Hooks seems to think that the possession of the feathers themselves, even without displaying them, that latent power is the problem itself. Hooks has this quote somewhere in the book that if men were natural born killers, we wouldn't need to socialize them into becoming soldiers. However, I think here she's missing the forest from the trees. The reason why men go to war is not because society has socialized men or us into doing that. It's because we are naturally inclined towards aggression. We are naturally inclined towards violence given the right incentives, which society has an abundance of. War isn't a domestic psychological defect that is perpetrated by, as Bell Hooks puts it, a white capitalist patriarchy. I believe she has other buzzwords in there that I'm blanking on. It is a geopolitical immune system. Again, to disarm ourselves is to put us at the peril of other countries who have no compunctions whatsoever with attacking and being the aggressors. Hooks seems to think we live in this idealistic world where everything can be reduced to culture. The issue with this is that without recognizing the biological underpinnings of certain overexpressions of behavior, we are dooming ourselves to ineffective solutions or counterproductive ones. The way we would grapple with biological problems is quite different from the way we would grapple with cultural problems. They are more intractable, not impossible to solve, but just more difficult. And we have to get our story straight if we are going to have any chance at moving the needle on how people behave. Hooks recounts this childhood memory where her father stifles her from expressing what she considers to be her naturally aggressive behavior as compared to her brothers. She views this as him imposing his patriarchy upon her. There's this implicit contradiction that Hooks seems to not recognize here, which is that her aggression being stifled as a kid, she considers to be a lost virtue. It is an act of patriarchy. However, her father's aggression is a pathology. And this is a confusion that Hooks does not seem to come to any consistency about throughout the book, not knowing whether she is extolling aggression and power or she is vilifying it. She only seems to extol it when it is something that women are aspiring towards and vilify it when men are the ones in those roles or aspiring towards those roles. But then in other parts, she turns around and says that feminists should not be aspiring towards these powerful and aggressive behaviors either because they are just being indoctrinated into the patriarchal mindset that they are trying to fight against. So she quite explicitly recognizes this inconsistency, and yet she falls into it time and time again when she talks about how bad it is, when she laments her inability to express her aggression and her power. On the flip side of this is the question, if a mother were to stifle her son's gentleness, is that matriarchy or is that just parenting? I actually know what Hooks would respond to this question because she said as much in several parts of the book, which is that that too would be a manifestation of the patriarchy because this mother would have been captured by the patriarchal ideology that men are supposed to fit these aggressive roles and women are supposed to fit into these feeble, nurturing roles. So whenever Hooks is being consistent about vilifying aggression, she does stick to it by maintaining that it is not only wrong when men do it, it is also wrong when women do it. However, this starts to fall apart, as I just mentioned, when she starts to act as though in certain cases where women are the ones aspiring towards aggression, then it becomes a virtue somehow. This inconsistency is further emphasized when Hooks goes on to talk about the Harry Potter novels as basically a white boy dominates society story. But this begs the question, why would we not consider it to be patriarchy if it were a woman, or why would she not consider it to be patriarchy if it were a woman or a girl who played the protagonist in the Harry Potter novels, which I'm quite sure she would not. This is the very inconsistency that I mean. This is the flip flopping, whereby on the one hand, Hooks might say something like, well, regardless of if it's a man or a woman, if they are espousing an interest in gender norms, then that is patriarchal. However, when it comes to an actual display of that behavior, then somehow it's virtuous when a woman is the one displaying aggressiveness and domineering behavior. But when a man does it, then it's patriarchal. And if it's gender that makes the difference here, then how does gender transform what is an otherwise insidious and pernicious behavior into one that is virtuous? This book is also scant on facts and data and heavy on anecdotes and bold assertions. One of these assertions she makes is that all boys are raised to be killers. The study Hooks uses to back up this bold assertion is one that she was vague about, but I looked into it and I believe she's referring to the Malamute study, which found that 12% of college boys, prime age and gender for egregious, reckless behavior, mind you, they found that these boys said that 12% of them said that it was okay to rape women. And 30% said that it was okay to force themselves on women. So when the question changed from rape to force, which is essentially the same question, just dressed differently, the boys, more people, 30% more boys said that they would do that. As I said, this is completely unjustified behavior. This, even if it's an idea, it's one that is concerning. However, that is 30%, even at the higher end, is far from a majority of males. And this study was not conducted on women to act as some sort of a control. How do we know there isn't like 20%, or because I'm guessing, to give her the benefit of the doubt using this study, I'm gonna go on a gander and say that women would probably not have that high. However, they would have something that would be interesting to compare that male statistic to. The fact that it was only males who were sampled in this study reflects to me an inherent bias, which does not do much to offer me some assurance about the credibility of this study. Hooks also has this palpable racial undertone throughout the book. She starts with this hillside strangler who's white, to male executives who are white, to constantly comparing whiteness to toxicity. And this suggests that in her view, the wellspring of evil is not just male, but white male in particular, something that she spells out in several parts of the book. How exactly she translates whiteness into patriarchy or toxic masculinity is beyond me, because she never bothers to explain that. In Hook's world, no relationship passes the sniff test. She condemns her dad as being captured by patriarchy. She condemns her mother for being condemned by that. She condemns her ex for being captured by it. She condemns other feminists. She condemns the best of men and women who have written books about feminism, let alone the rest of us who are not even feminist or don't consider ourselves to be the neo-feminist. I mean, according to her definition and lack of an exemplar for who exactly embodies this idea of non-patriarchy that she harps about the entire book, it seems everyone, virtually everyone, is culpable for being a villain of patriarchy in her eyes, and also being a victim of it. And this is the impossible standard that Hooks has used to define patriarchy. She offers a diagnosis that is unfalsifiable and a cure that is biologically impossible. She wants to socialize men to be women, and she wants women to stop desiring masculine men. To point out male issues does not detract from female issues, but the strict labeling of male pathologies and overexpressions of masculinity as a pathology, and not doing the same for feminine overexpressions, as though somehow those do not become pathologized at some point, is a game of semantic keep away. And even if there were this crisis of patriarchy, as Bell seems to think, we cannot address that. We cannot even begin to address that without first understanding and acknowledging the biological underpinnings. What do you think? Is biology the missing link in this conversation? Let me know in the comments.